Do I have sound?
Yeah, we can hear you. Okay.
Okay. I didn't know if I could hear you, was what I was figuring out, but I think we do. Where are you driving, Arnold? Hi, Barb. Hi, Mark. All right, so it's 12:02. So by my watch, that says we're ready to rock and roll here. So I wanted to, so we're looking at this week's portion. I think we're going to look at it in a slightly different way than you usually do in this Tuesday class with Rabbi Rines, because why not? We're going to look at one specific piece here and extrapolate out what we can understand from that. So I'm going to pull up I've got a source sheet because I always have a source sheet. Where did it go? So we're going to look at, our portion this week is Naso. We're in Numbers. That's the second portion of Numbers. And there's a really interesting, arguably one of the most well-known passages of the Torah is in this Torah portion. Did anybody know what's in this portion?
Is that Ruth?
No. So this is the priestly blessing. Priestly blessings in this portion, which is may God bless you and keep you. Yivarechecha Adonai v'yishmerecha. It's the blessing we put our hands out. Known as the priestly blessing, that this was the blessing that the Birkat Kohanim are priests, that this is the blessing the priests would offer to the people. And we offer it at every turn. I think we did it this weekend like 6 times alone, right? We, at different life cycle moments, at other moments where we want to offer a blessing, it says in the Torah that this is the blessing that should be offered. So that's what we're going to look at today. And one specific issue we're going to pick up on. So let me put this up and we'll say our blessing for Torah study. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. So if we look here in this Numbers passage right at the top, so the first part says, Vaydaber Adonai Moshe lemor. And so God said to Moses, Daber al Haron ve'el banav, speak to Aaron and his sons, lemor, and say this, Ko chavrachu et b'nei Yisrael amor lahem. Thus you shall bless the people of Israel, say to them, so this is our intro, and then here's the blessing they offer, right? Yivarechecha Adonai v'yishmerecha, Ya'er Adonai panav elecha v'chonecha, Yisa Adonai panav elecha v'yasem lecha shalom. I'm going to get rid of the rest of it so we can't cheat here. So I've highlighted in blue panav. Does anybody know what panav usually translates to? Oh, wow, that was weird. Anybody know a common translation of panav? Panim. Panav is his face. That thing we remember when they told us at the first part of the pandemic, don't touch your face. And then all of us went like this. Right? That's what I think about. Lori and I are poking our faces. Face. So let's look at translations for those for just a moment. So I didn't translate it up here because I wanted to look at 3 different versions of translation. So JPS, that's Jewish Publication Society. That's who makes a lot of the Tanachim, the Tanachs that people tend to have at home. They're usually the leather-bound ones. It says this is also, JPS is what Sefaria uses. So if you look at Sefaria, that's JPS's translation. It says, the Lord bless you and protect you. The Lord deal kindly and graciously with you. The Lord bestow his favor upon you and grant you peace. Ignoring some weird verb tense things. What's not in that? There's no face. There's no mention of face in here. So the first line is very easy. This is pretty straightforward. Yivarechecha Adonai v'yishmerecha. Yivarech, baruch, bless, right? He will bless you. This this form of the verbs, which all match here. The yud at the beginning makes it future. This cha is to you. God will bless you. V'yishmerecha, right? A shomeret is a guard. Lishmor is to guard or protect. First line, pretty reasonable translation, right? That's pretty consistent throughout. Ya'er Adonai panav elecha v'chonecha. Here it says, the Lord deal kindly and graciously with you. Let's look at this line in the other two translations. These are two, this is another sort of standard, mostly academic translation, ESV. And then Everett Fox, I don't know if anybody's ever looked at Everett Fox's stuff. He has a Torah translation that he believes to be pretty literal and generally is pretty literal. So, Ya'er Adonai panav elecha v'chonecha. The Lord deal kindly and gracious with you. The Lord makes his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. May Yahweh, so Yud He Vav He is this name of God that's right here. That's where the idea of Yahweh comes from. In academic context or often in Christian context, that the Hebrew God is called Yahweh. It's because it's this sort of strange translation of the Yud He Vav He. So may God bless you and keep you. May God shine his face upon you and favor you. Ya'er, or shine, it's something about light. The light, and then we have face here. V'chonecha. Chen is grace. So gracious unto you. The other pieces don't seem to be so complicated. Where it changes is the panav. So let's look at the third line. Yisa Adonai panav elecha v'yasem lecha shalom. The Lord bestow his favor upon you and grant you peace. Yet again, we have no face. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. And then they have a footnote that says, or face. But countenance is often used here. And then, may God lift up his face toward you and grant you shalom.
Jordy?
Yeah, Barb.
My daughter recites this or delivers this to her children similar. It's taken from this every Shabbat. She does the children's prayer. Mm-hmm. So pieces of this are very, very familiar to me.
We do. So there's a really great kids version that was written by a woman who goes by Miss Emily Sings. That's her company name. Right. The way that they phrase this in there is, may God bless you and God keep you, shine light on you, help you find peace. Is this what they use, Barb?
Yeah.
May God watch you and stay with you forever and ever. Amen. It's fabulous. We're going to do it at preschool graduation. Arnold, I hope you'll be at preschool graduation this week. We're going to do it at preschool graduation this week. It's a beautiful sentiment. And there's an issue with how we're preserving this. Specifically this word. So panim is face. What's interesting is panim is in the plural permanently. The word panim is always plural, which there's all kinds of other writing about why it is that way, and that no one has a face. We have faces to ourselves. We have all kinds of metaphors that involve faces. But why do you think, why are some of these translations maybe hesitant on face? The JPS is very hesitant, so hesitant that they don't do it. What do you think any hesitancy would be about putting the word face in a translation?
They don't want you to think of him as a person.
Don't want to think of God as a person. Absolutely. It's my favorite word. I love an opportunity to use it. So thank you, Jerry. Anthropomorphizing God. Anthropomorphism is making God human. I love to say it. So we don't want to do that, right? There's some hesitancy to that often. Lori, were you going to say something?
Well, there's all that scripture. I'm talking on Mark's microphone.
I hear you and I see you. I got you.
The scripture, when Moses was encountering God about how, he could not see, most of the time, he could not see wasn't allowed to see his face, and now the people weren't allowed to see God's face. And also what Jerry said about we're not supposed to have any images of God, make any images of God.
Absolutely. Lori, I'll pay you later, because that's exactly where we're going in Exodus. We're going to go to this with Moses. And I'll tell you, whenever I think about images of God, it always makes me laugh. My parents, anybody remember the Shel Silverstein books?
Oh, yeah.
Right? The Giving Tree, all the poetry books, all of that stuff. he had, at one point, Shel Silverstein came out with a workbook that was all these prompts to be creative. And I was not like a particularly creative or an imaginative child. When people asked me what I wanted to be when I grew up, I'd say, that's ridiculous. I couldn't possibly know that. I'm a child. What I say now will not be what happens. That was who I was. And so parents got me this book, I think, in an effort to prompt some imagination. And there's a page that says, what do you think God looks like? And I drew like this little jelly bean hanging on a cloud. And my parents lost it. They could not figure out what to do because they knew they had some vague awareness I wasn't supposed to do that, but they weren't sure what to do from there. What do you do, right? So we shouldn't make images of God. Well, why not, right? They didn't have a great explanation for a kid who was going to say, well, why was this bad, right? Why did I do a bad thing? I don't understand, right? So we're going to look at this. We've got a couple of instances where we talk about God's face, and that's what we're going to dive into. Let me put it up on my screen.
So Jordy, I just have a thought here.
Yes.
As I'm listening. When I think of a face, it doesn't have to have eyes and ears and nose and mouth. I'm thinking I can go in a different direction and think of a face of being nature. And
yes, we're gonna
and looking, you know. So
yes, absolutely. There's something to that. We're going to start to build out, what does this mean, right? What would God's face mean? We're going to look at the way our tradition addresses it, which contradicts itself. And then we're going to try and understand it. What does this mean, this blessing? God's face should turn onto you, right? You should feel the light of God's face. Barb, since you're unmuted already, do you want to read for us from Exodus 33?
Sure. And the Lord said to Moses, this very thing that you have spoken, I will do, for you have found favor in my sight. And I know you by name, Moses said, please show me your glory. And he said, I will make all my goodness pass before you and will proclaim before you my name. The Lord and I will be gracious to whom I will be gracious, and will show mercy on whom I will show mercy. But he said, you cannot see my face, for man shall not see me and live. And the Lord said, behold, there is a place by me where you shall stand on the rock. And while my glory passes by, I will put you in a cleft of the rock, and I will cover you with my hand until I have passed by. Then I will take away my hand, and you shall see my back, but my face shall not be seen. But he's saying he has a hand though.
So let's look at this. So this is the first introduction of this concept. Not the first. Here is an introduction, probably the most well-known introduction of this concept, that if you see God's face, you die, right? You cannot see my face, for a man shall not see me and live, right? And this becomes foundational to a lot of different concepts we have, right? So like if we think about temple culture and the high priests, there was a room called the Kodesh HaKodashim. The temple was set up like an onion, right? And each layer of the onion that you peeled, there were different people allowed in each segment, right? So like outside, women and slaves were allowed, which is really nice of them to let us hang there, right? And then the next level is just the men. And then the next level and the next level, the next level. And the most innermost spot is the Kodesh HaKodashim, the Holy of Holies, where it's believed that God lives. And so when the high priest would go in, they would tie a rope to his ankle, right? So that if he was struck dead by the magnitude of God or from seeing God's face, they could pull him back out. They could get his body back out, right? So we have this pretty ingrained concept. You see my face, says God, and you die. Okay. And so what happens here? How do they get around it? You said this, Barb. How do they get around it?
They use a hand.
Yeah. Well, so first he positions, there's some creative positioning, right?
Uh-huh.
It's about putting him behind a rock. There's using a hand. There's some kind of shielding. There are a lot of ways we can imagine this scenario based on what we have, but there's some kind of shielding that means that Moses only sees, you shall see my back. V'ra'iti et achorai, you should see behind me. Ufanai lo yir'u, and my face you will not see. So what Moses originally asked to see, which is kind of interesting. What does Moses say? Please show me your glory. I kept traditional translations on these sort of mainstream translations for us to play with. He said, Hareini na et kivodecha. Anybody ever say kol hakavod, right? All of the honor. That's what we say to someone. Kibud avvaim, Barb and Lori, we just studied this, right? Honor one fathers and mothers. So show me your glory, show me your honor is what Moses asks for. And that's then interpreted as face, because the response comes back as, you can't see my face, right? Moses says, show me all that is your power. And God says, okay, here's what I'm going to show you, but it won't be my face. They're distinguishing these pieces. And if you look, all of the blue are any root that speaks to face, right? Including lefanecha, which is in a bunch of prayers we have. It's in a lot of places. Lefanecha means before you. Lifnei is before. It has the same root as a face. Before your face is what we're calling it. So it's mostly sort of coincidental in here, but is sort of noteworthy how many moments we have face mentioned in just these couple of verses. So we have this fundamental idea, you can't see God's face.
So does God have a face?
Well, we're talking about God's face, and the blessing above says our highest blessing for you is that you should see God's face. So how does that work, right? That's not a great blessing. So if you see God's face and you die, and my highest blessing for you is that you see God's face, ipso facto here, right? My highest blessing for you is that you die. That doesn't work out so well. That's some blessing, huh? There's a fundamental problem here, right? If this is what we understand. We've got a couple other instances, though, where we see a face. Jerry, I saw you unmute.
No, that's okay. I had it muted. I was talking to Natalie, but
I don't want to miss out on any Jerry wisdom. Just checking in. So here's a different scenario where we're going to talk about seeing God's face. Will someone read from Genesis for us? Laura, you're usually good for it.
I'll read it.
Oh, Jerry, go for it.
The
Laura, you'll go next.
The same night he arose and took his 2 wives, his 2 female servants, and his 7 children, and crossed the ford of the Jabbok.
He's Jacob. Jacob is who we're talking about. Keep going.
Okay. He took them and sent them across the stream and everything else that he had. And Jacob was left alone, and the man wrestled with him until the breaking of day. When the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he touched his hip socket, and Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. Then he said, "Let me go, for the day has broken." But Jacob said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." And he said to him, "What is your name?" And he said, "Jacob." Then he said, "Your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with men and have prevailed." Then Jacob asked him, "Please tell me your name." But he said, "Why is that you ask my name?" And there he blessed him. So Jacob called the name of the place Peniel, saying, "For I have seen God face to face, and yet my life has been delivered."
So here's what happened. Jacob says, I saw God face to face in this encounter. So presumably he's believing that, and sort of an accepted position is that this man that Jacob wrestled with is some kind of angel. Jacob walks away from this encounter and says, I saw God's face. And I lived. And so I'll honor this place by giving this place. And that's not his only piece of evidence, right? What's the other piece of evidence that he saw God's face? He just fought with this guy. And then what does he hear? Your name should be Israel because you have struggled with God, right? Yisrael, El on the end of anything is God. So this man says, you just struggled with God. Not a big leap for Jacob. Is this God? Right? Is this God in this form of a man? But if he saw God's face, how does that check out with what God tells Moses? How does that work out? That if you see God's face, you die.
Well,
They saw God's face. And presumably if you're wrestling, right, in the first situation with Moses, God's face is hidden, right? There's all sort of these angles that they're working. So Moses doesn't actually see God's face. But if you're wrestling, You can't do that. I don't think they had like the, the Mexican wrestler mask at that point in time. That feels like a little.
I was just thinking about what in the Guide to Perplex, what Maimonides says about that. He says that you can't make God, you can't into like human form and those types of things. And it seems like it's all metaphor and used in different ways for different cases. And then I also think about what the Kabbalah says, that you can't, that there's layers of the worlds. That's one concept. And when we're in this state, you really can't see the full emanation of God anyhow. So like it just seems all metaphor to me.
So, and you're not alone in feeling like it's all metaphor. And one of our pieces we're going to read in a bit references Maimonides' thoughts on this. But, one of the challenges is when we find something that's a contradiction in the Torah, right, that rattles us and we try and explain it. And so to explain it as all metaphor is really common, and yet there's something very practical that was introduced in Exodus, right? You cannot see my face, for man shall not see me and live. And so that feels really practical. And it's beautiful. There's so much we can do with metaphor. And yet, how do we handle metaphor around that specific sentiment? You gonna solve all my problems, Lewis?
I'm sorry. It just seems to me like when you're dead, that's when you're reconnected. That spirit is reconnected with God. That's when you really can see God's face, if you will. But as long as you're here, you don't.
It's fair. And then you go back and you say, well, if that was the case, then why is there all of this maneuvering done with Moses and God on this rock, on this cliff edge, right? To not see God's face so he doesn't accidentally die, right? How does that work out then? What is that fueling? How does that fit in the metaphor?
What is God's face, though?
Another excellent question. Excellent question, which we're going to get to. I want to look at two more Torah pieces on sort of that show Rashi's discomfort. I would say it's discomfort with this potential contradiction. So we've got, let me put this up. So Exodus 24, 9 through 10. Here's what it says. It says, then Moses and Aaron and Nadav and Avihu, the 70 elders of Israel, went up. Nadav and Avihu are Aaron's sons. And they saw the God of Israel. They saw the God of Israel. What does that mean? So you look at this and Rashi says, well, that could be problematic, right? If we say that if you see God, you die, how did they all see the God of Israel, right? Is God lying? How does that work? So here's what Rashi says. They gazed intently, and failing in this, they peeped in their attempt to catch a glimpse of the supreme being, right? So they tried really hard, right, not to get involved in this, and then they couldn't, right? They did one of these, right? Cover my eyes. That's how our preschoolers say Shema. It's my favorite thing. They cover their eyes, and I look, and they're like, anything happening anywhere, right? So they peeped in their attempt to catch a glimpse of the supreme being, and thereby made themselves liable to death. Okay, so Rashi's trying to hold on to this idea, you see God's face and you die. And so now they're saying, okay, so they tried not to, but they couldn't help it. Now they're liable to death, but they don't die right away. So how does that go? How does that work? But it was only because God did not wish to disturb the joy caused by the giving of the Torah, that he did not, which is what they were up there for, that he did not punish them instantly, but waited and postponed the punishment for Nadav and Avihu until the day when the tabernacle was dedicated, when they were stricken by their death. There's a problem with Nadav and Avihu's death. I think we studied it in some different capacities in the last couple of months because I love that piece. I think it's really fascinating, right? It says Nadav and Avihu died be'esh zara, in a strange fire. That's what they offered to God. They offered an esh zara as an offering to the temple. It's not clear what the problem was with that. It's a foreign fire is what that means. We don't really know what it was. We don't know what the problem was necessarily, and they're struck dead on the spot. It's a problem. It's missing information. And so Rashi's saying, well, here's an opportunity to kill two birds with one stone. So I'm going to make a couple connections and fix a couple problems all at once, right? Problem number one, they saw God and they lived. Problem number two, later we've got these guys who sort of spontaneously die. How are we going to I can put those both in one explanation. right? So that's what he's done. He's combined them. So what is he saying? It wasn't that they saw God's face and didn't die. It's that God was really excited about the Torah. It was a really big deal and didn't want to upstage, didn't want to, you're having a great day. You don't want to take on the icky stuff on a great day, right? Right? You have an argument, is coming, you put it off, right? Because it's a really good day and I don't want that on a good day. Essentially what he's saying, God does, right? But they can't go completely unpunished for having looked. And so Nadav and Avihu, why not the 70 other elders? Why not Moses and Aaron? Excellent question. Just these two get killed, but these two died. That's the reason they died, was they looked. So look how complicated Rashi is making this to try and explain this away, because there's deep discomfort with this. Why do you think this is uncomfortable? I'm thinking of two main reasons that Rashi's trying to fill in these holes.
Well, the reference, I feel like a broken record here. The reference to a face. Face to most people means something concrete, not something abstract.
Well, yes. And I think related to that, which is sort of where I'm sitting, is that physical depictions of a deity were not a very Jewish thing. That was what the pagans did, right? Mm-hmm. Other cultures they were coming in contact with had much more of that within their culture. And so in part of this intense fear about Jewish continuity, which is what all of these guys are motivated by, right? I don't want it to look like what they have, right? We want to be careful about some kind of physical depiction of God. That's one of the problems, right? And that physical depiction of God, Barb, you're right, is sort of narrow, is what they're looking at in that context. And I think we've expanded that a little bit about what is a face, right? But that's not quite where they were yet. The other big problem here is, does God not make good on what God says, right? So God says, you see my face, you die. And then all these people live. So it's 70 elders, Nadav and Avihu, Moses and Aaron. You got 74 people who saw God's face. And then they all come down and, go have a beer together. Is God's word not good? That's a really big problem. And so we have to find a way to make this work. That's what Rashi's doing.
But in Judaism, it's always been my understanding is that as good Jews, as righteous Jews, we need to approach the spirit or concept, whatever we want to call it, of God. And are we ever there?
Yeah, I think one of the things that is both challenging and beautiful about Judaism is that we don't have one specific theology. Theology is all a little, in our traditional representations, we have a lot of different theologies presented all at once, all the time, right? Mm-hmm. And as you get further into study, you're able to start to parse those out and understand. And so that's absolutely a view of a Jewish perspective on theology, which starts to make some good on some of this. But in a really to sort of put ourselves, that's a really modern view, right? Modern as in, not last 10 years, but like last couple hundred.
Reformed.
On some levels, for sure. If we're thinking about, for our traditional commentators, for Rashi, right? It's not where he is. Rashi's looking at this and saying, yikes, this is a problem, right? Mm-hmm. I've got two big problems. I've got lack of consistency and a question about the validity of God's word. And the other big one that we have here, so we saw that God told Moses, you can't see my face or you're going to die. Then what do we have in Deuteronomy? And there has not arisen a prophet since Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face, panim el panim. Well, what do you do with that, right? Didn't God just say to him over here that you can't see my face? Yeah. And now it says, knew him face to face, panim el panim. So Rashi's twitching. Rashi's absolutely twitching. And so what does Rashi say? He said, this actually means, that doesn't you think it means? Here's what it means. That he was familiar with God and used to speak with God at any time he desired. Just as it stated, Moses said, now I will ascend to the Lord. And then stay and I will hear what God will command regarding you. It's trying to say that Moses sort of had free access to God, right? And could talk to God whenever he wanted. And so that's actually what this means. That they were really tight, right? That it was a strong relationship, perhaps the strongest relationship God's ever had with a mortal being. But then why does it say panim el panim?
Yeah, but it says the Lord knew face to face. There's a difference between knowing and seeing.
Yes, absolutely. Fair. Absolutely. And that's a reasonable translation. That's a good translation. Yada'u. Knew God, panim el panim. Knew God face to face. But what does it mean to know someone? What an interesting question to ask after the last year we've had. What does it mean to know someone face to face? It's now happening that all of these people that I exclusively know on Zoom, right? I was only at Sinai, what is it, like 7 months, 8 months, 9 months, something like that before pandemic hit, right? So a lot of our community, I mostly know on Zoom. There are a lot of people I've only met on Zoom, and now I'm meeting them in person. I didn't know them face to face. Zoom is arguably face to face, but if we're talking about, this, what happens in a face to face interaction, right? You pick up on body language, you have this closeness, there's an intimacy, there's eye contact, there are all of these things. We haven't had those in the same kind of way. And yet I wouldn't say that I know these people any less well. I think I actually know many of them far better than people I know from in-person life. So what does it mean to know someone face to face?
Well, I'm not sure we should take this literally.
You and Lewis.
I think it's more of a, when you meet someone, talk with someone face to face, your point is so well taken, with what we've gone through for almost a year and a half. But I think it's an internal type of relationship. Moses didn't see God. He didn't see God's face. He saw a burning bush.
So absolutely. I think there's a definite tension here between literal and metaphorical.
Yes.
Metaphorical is a modern read on how we can take this. Our commentators weren't there. They were concerned about a literal, right? And the words of the blessing feel very literal, right? If we go back, Yisa Adonai panav elecha. Visa is to turn, right? God turn, lift, really is better. Lift, God will lift his face to you, right? Look up at you, right? Look to you so that you can see, right? When you lift your head, you lift it so someone can see your face, right? So I'm not like this. I lift my face.
If we were to use a different word besides face, what could we use?
Well, so, other
Spirit.
commentators and translators will say countenance, but I think that's kind of silly. I don't like that word very much. Panim is very literally face.
Right.
It's almost like connection, because
Right.
The word face can be used for a lot of things. Like the face of a physical object just means the front of something. So, and when you're
On the
dealing with
face
something
of
front
things.
on, it is a connection. But there's levels of connection.
Yeah, I agree with
I think that
Lewis.
is an interpretive. I think you're a couple steps down on interpreting the idea, though, right? I think that if you're looking at connection, I think you're a couple steps down the road and have left behind this very concrete idea of a face, right? So panim el panim is talking about if you're face to face with someone, that's connection, is what they're saying. Really reasonable to say that that's the proof. There was no other prophet in time that had the connection with God that Moses had. I think that's a really accurate and fair statement. That's a beautiful way to interpret this and to carry on and live your life. But I don't know that solves the problem of a very functional term, panim. There's not really any sort of linguistic complication to the term. I think there's something fundamental to it. And so I think that I think there's two sort of metaphorical directions to take here if we want to try and extrapolate and interpret. I think there's the direction you're going, Lewis, right? Which is talking about connection. I think there's the direction, Barb, you've been pushing towards, which is what's a face?
Yeah.
There's a
face. So if I'm looking at somebody in the face, I see their eyes. And and when you're looking at somebody, it's different when you look at somebody in their eyes than if you're just looking at the back of their head. And that is, it is a communication and an understanding that you don't see. Like I understand people more when I'm looking at them in the face and in their eyes.
Mhm.
I don't know why, but it's, to me, that's kind of what the main difference. What is a face is the front of something.
Well, they say the eyes are the gateway to the soul.
So absolutely. There's a book, I don't know if anybody's ever read anything by Art Green. He's pretty mysticism is really his jam, which is really not my jam. And yeah, I really like this. This is the most concrete piece I've ever been able to get into. It's called Seek My Face, a Jewish mystical theology. Clearly, I mean, mine's covered in Post-its and highlights. So I got into it. And there's a passage here that I wanted us to look at because I think it may comfort some of the challenges we're having, right? And my push here is not that we can't, find metaphor and find interpretation. I think it's before you can get there, you need to understand sort of foundationally what the challenge is, right? What the challenge the text is presenting, and then how do we find our way through that? So here's what Art Green says. At the very least, we should follow Maimonides, thank you, Lewis, in understanding the face of these passages in a metaphoric way. God's face refers to God's presence, a sense of close encounter or intense awareness. If God has a face, we tend to believe, surely it's a projection of the human face. It is we who take the mysterious and faceless one of the universe and make it into a human-like deity. There you go, Barb. That is our need and our right. God would have no face if we did not ascribe a face to God. But what face is it that we ascribe to the one? Does each of us lend God his or her own face? Is it the multiple faces of those who we love in our lifetime that we collectively project onto God? Or is face only an inherited figure of speech, something that we pick up from the ancient sources of traditional religion, rather than something we create or project on our own?
I have to share. I often, when I'm in nature and I'm just like taking it all in, my thoughts go to this tells me there's a God out there. And what I was saying before is, to me personally, and it's just my view, is that when I feel this and see this beauty that we have in this world, it brings me, closer to the belief in God. And is that, for me personally, is that the face of God? Who knows? It's all
I love this idea that God didn't have to have a face. We need God to have a face, right? It's it's we who take the mysterious and faceless one of the universe and make it into a human-like deity, right? Are we so uncomfortable with this abstract notion that we need to concretize?
Yeah.
Well, I think there's such a strong yearning in us to want to know God, to want to understand God, and that's part.
Yes.
But I guess what you're saying then is that we need to understand what the term face-to-face meant to those who wrote the Torah. Is that what you're saying part of it is?
I think we've got a couple of challenges here. I think that there our traditional commentators like Rashi are reading this literally. And so I think it's important that we understand the challenge that these texts present when we're looking at face literally. I think that's one piece of this. And then I think we look at metaphorically, what is God's face? I think they're two separate intellectual endeavors we have going at the same time. And I think that understanding the literal struggle, right? The struggle of literally thinking face, like this is my face.
Right.
I think it's important foundation to then understanding what is this metaphorical face of God? What does it mean to be face to face with God if it's not my punim next to your punim, right? What does it mean to see God's face, to know God's face, for the light of God's face to shine upon you? Right? But I think that understanding the level one of struggle, literal, and then that helps be the foundation for our metaphorical understanding.
I think the problem is when they say that we're created in God's image, because you're using the English language or the Hebrew language or the Spanish language to introduce concepts that man understands, but is different from the spiritual world where God lives.
Yes. So that's the other complicator in this conversation, right? So the only thing we do know about potentially, and we can also look at metaphorically too, but potentially know about a physical form of God is that we're created b'tselem Elohim, in God's image. Tselem is the root for in modern Hebrew for photography, right? All the photography words are rooted to tzadik lamed mem, right? Sivlum l'tsalem is to take a photo. Image is a really reasonable way to literally understand that term. And so how do we understand that, right? If God's face isn't really a face, the way we understand a face, then maybe if we're created in God's image, is that a physical image? Or is that in the image of God's hopes and dreams? Is that, we are our own image and, God holds that form? I mean, how do those two pieces relate, right? And Art Green spoke to this. He said, does each of us lend to God his or her own face? Mark, was that a hand?
Yes, it was. I just wanted to clarify, does it say in the text that we are created in God's images, or does it say we are created in our image? Which was always a puzzling thing for me. Who was God talking to?
I'm going to pull it up right now. Let me pull it up so we look at the text. Hold on, let me pull it. Why can't I pull it up? Let me get it. Here we go. Okay. So I'm going to show you the dorky stuff I've got on here. This is Bible software. So this is the screen I'm pulling us into. Okay, so Genesis 1 says, then God says, let us make man in our image. See, look what it does. When you highlight a Hebrew word, it'll pull it up in English and vice versa. Let's make man in God's image. B'tselmenu. Let's make man in our image, which is also part of the problem because Elohim is plural. It's a plural word for God. And so it's not in my image, says God, it's in our image. That's a challenge for another day about how that fits into monotheistic thought, right? And let them have dominion over the fish in the sea, yada, 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 yada. Vayivra Elohim et ha'adam b'tselmo, b'tselem Elohim bara oto. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. It's got b'tselem Elohim, right, is the phrase that we use. But it doesn't just say it once, it says it twice, which isn't so unusual. Vayivra Elohim, and God created, et ha'adam, man, b'tselmo, in his image, right, is in reflected to God, in God's image. B'tselem Elohim bara oto. In the image of God, he created them.
But God didn't write this.
Well, so a traditional perspective would say, yes, we tend to
I
not
know,
operate with
I
that.
know.
But yes. But what does it mean? I mean, and we hold on to this. One of my High Holy Day sermons may be on the image of God because I've been fixated for a couple of months on some of these ideas. But So stay tuned. But we rely heavily on that idea of being created in the image of God, especially in the world we're living in today, where identity expression has so opened up, right? That's been a big foundational rooting in the LGBT community, right? I was created in God's image. And so I am holy and sacred as I am and as I identify in who I am, right?
Mm-hmm.
We really hold on to that. And so, but what does that mean to be created in God's image if we're going to say that God doesn't really have a face, right? So if that's not a physical image, what is that?
Potential.
We're
Sorry,
interpreting.
Lori.
Oh, excuse me, Barb.
No,
We're
go ahead.
interpreting in God's image to mean like us, but we don't know what God's image is. Yeah. Have you ever listened to that podcast, Z-Dog?
No, I don't know.
No.
Well, I listened a little bit. He's this physician that talked a lot about COVID, Stanford educated. Anyway, he's really interested in consciousness, and he interviews people that have neuroscientists and psychiatrists who talk about consciousness and some of the new research that suggests that the mind is separate from the brain and that consciousness exists apart from the brain. And then the other day he interviewed this man, I can't think of his name now, but he wrote a book called The Case Against Reality or something that talks about how reality is just something we've created for ourselves so that we can survive. And I don't know, I want to read the book, but it opens up the idea that, you know, there's just so much that we don't understand. And when we talk about the image of God, or we have no idea what God is. And you know, that the image of God idea is going to change, and maybe some of the metaphors that we talk about now aren't really metaphors. Maybe they're reality. And I don't know. It's just an interesting idea that I wanted to bring up.
Thank you. Yeah, Lewis, I see you.
We always want to put containers in things and define things in a container. And there's another realm, it seems to me, that's not contained. And the image thing is kind of part of that. So like there's a part of us that's in the image, but like my face is not in the image of God. And so it just seems like it's hard. By the way, that Z-Dog guy, he's a friend of my best man at my wedding. They studied together at Stanford. He's a super smart guy, and they both studied consciousness together. And he's an interesting guy. I just think that a lot of this is just trying us to define things in a almost like a scientific way or you know, observable way, when you really can't do that.
For sure. I mean, you're a better mystic than I am, Lewis, right? And so if you can take it into that place, that works really well, right? And if that's, I'm a firm believer that your brain is either wired for that kind of thinking or it's not, right? I always talk about this. My students who are in the conversion process taking Intro to Judaism, they walk out of I always warn them that you're going to walk out of the Kabbalah class, the mysticism class, and either say, whoa, that was awesome, or whoa, I don't get it, right? And there tend to not be very many people in between. I think it's either how your brain processes the world or it doesn't, right? I'm not particularly inclined to it. I'm a really rational person, right? And so, which has its benefits and it has its limitations, which here is I'm happy to be open to the argument that it's limiting here, right? Any kind of sort of a concrete rational notion narrows what could be and how we could understand this.
Yeah, I think rationality is, I'm big on rationality, big time. I'm a math guy, but then you get to this concept of a null set where there's nothing beyond that. And then the irrational, like you said, the limitations of rationality become really clear when you get into this stuff.
Yeah.
If there is rationality in it.
What was that? I didn't hear that question.
I said, if there is rationality in it. I mean, I'm thinking back to when David Saunders spoke in an evening program. And, I'm trying to follow what he's talking about, and I was just like, whoa, I was really having a hard time following, and I usually can, understand and absorb abstract thought, but whoa, for me personally, I had a really hard time with that.
I've said it before, I think, that when I took Kabbalah in rabbinical school, the professor used to have to sit with me for about a half hour after each class and then say, no, go back. And then he'd get half of just say, pause, hold on. And then I'd ask 7 questions about the first half of the sentence. And then we go to the next half of the sentence. And that was how I got through Kabbalah, right? Like there's a great Hebrew expression that is usually used when it's sort of old school. But usually used when you're struggling with learning a language, but struggling with anything, you say, lokech shenayim, you break your teeth on it, right? Is what it means to struggle. I love it because it feels like such a rational, concrete image that goes along with it, right? And I think that that's one of the ways that some of us respond to these pieces, for sure. So all of this said, what does this mean? If we look at the Fox translation, let's say that, may God shine his face upon you and be, I'm going to use an interim translation. I'm going to say how I usually say it. May God bless you and keep you. May God's light shine upon you and be gracious to you. That's how I translate it, because to me that feels reasonable. I think it's really talking about light and not face. I think the light of God's face, I think when the light of, if I were to say, Barb, let your light come through, right? Let the light of your face come through. What I'd be saying is, Barb, let us see you, right? Let us see the brightness that you bring to the world, right? Mm-hmm. And may God's face, I change it every time I do it, right? And may God's face turn towards you, and may that bring you peace. What does that mean? If we're going to, in metaphor, in literal, in whatever it is, right? It's pretty clear that I think we can't take it in the literal, because the greatest blessing we're offering isn't, you should see God's face and die. So what does it mean? So if we're not literal, what does it mean?
I don't know what it means. I mean, aside from talking about what it means, when the rabbi does this blessing at the end of services, I love it. It makes me feel great for some reason. It just makes me feel so good. And I'm not sure why. I guess it feels so supportive, and it kind of brings God near, and I don't know. I
feel the same way about it. And I think part of what it sounds like you're responding to, Laurie, is that maybe you're responding less to sort of the language of the blessing and more the intention and sentiment of it, right? That they're offering the highest blessing that our tradition knows how to give, right? Yeah. That's what you're offering. And it's all, I think priestly blessing is always offered with good intention, right? And anytime someone wishes you something good in that way. The other thing, which is one of Rabbi Ryan's big teaching, he talks about it all the time, right? He says that Numbers says, "Va'ani avarchem," say this to the people, right? And I will bless them, right? That it's a blessing from God delivered by a human.
In 39 years of marriage, that's the first time Laurie ever told me that. I've never heard that before. And I always liked that prayer because it was my favorite one as a kid, because I knew services were going to be over right away.
If looks could kill, wowza, you'd be in trouble, Mark. Yeah, maybe you see Laurie's face and you die. Maybe that's what's happening here. That was a look you got.
That was just catching my breath. Not dying.
But so I think Laurie, you've identified that there's 2 pieces of receiving this blessing, right? There's one that's I think about the phenomenon of the blessing, maybe is a word we could use, right? Or the conceptual foundation for receiving blessing and the way it makes you feel and the relationship you have with the person who's offering the blessing, all of those pieces. And what does this blessing mean? I think that's the other side to the coin, right? Beyond that, it's a blessing we've offered for generations upon generations upon generations of our tradition, which is really meaningful to me, right? I tell all of our mitzvah students, you got this when you were born. You'll get this one day when you're married, right? This is going to follow every life moment with you. And it's going to be the same thing that your parents had and their parents had and their parents had. right? Or if you convert or you're new to this tradition, you're going to create this for generations of your family to come. You're going to get this blessing upon the moment of your conversion, and it's going to stay with your family for the rest of your life, right? And beyond you. Something really powerful about that. But I think that's about the phenomenon of the blessing and not the blessing itself, if that's a distinction that sits. So what does the blessing itself mean? What does this mean? I think the second line is a little easier, right? The light to shine on you. The last one is the one I struggle. May God lift up God's face to you, and may that bring you peace.
Well, there's a repetition of you in here, and that's such a personal thing. It's what you feel inside. Okay, I'm not speaking universally. I'm talking only from my view. What I feel inside. And when I see you, I say, how am I accepting this? How am I living this? And it's different for every person.
You're right. There is a lot of you. So just to look at the Hebrew, every time you see this, the cha at the end here is you. So
Okay.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. In not very many words.
Right.
It's a very personal thing. So I remember as a kid, my dad would be real busy and he would be in the paper or something. And then I wanted to talk to him. And then when he lifted his face up to look at me, he was connecting with me at that moment. And I felt closer to him. That's kind of how it seems to me with the lift your face up upon you.
I love that.
That's beautiful.
And maybe that is what this is. Maybe this is, we use face as a metaphor because it's something that relates to us, because we have a concept of what it means when someone turns their face to you, right? And makes eye contact and looks to you. And that maybe what we're actually hoping you'll find from God is, a sign of something, right? To feel God's presence, to feel God is with you specifically, right? There are a lot of people in the world. God's pretty busy, we'd imagine, right? And that what you should feel is this moment where God looks right at you. And it's not that person over there and not at the whole room, right? But that God looks at you. God turns God's face to you and lifts it so that you can see something, right? And you feel attended to.
There are times.
Pretty good, Dr. Rabbi Jordy.
Oh,
Yeah.
Thank you.
There have been times, particularly with my older granddaughter, and I've said this to my husband many times. I said, I feel like when she looks at me, I feel like she's looking into my soul and I'm looking into her soul. And maybe that's what it's all about. I don't know.
I think it's reasonable for us to look here and say, we have this really sort of physical language to represent something that we don't have other words for, right? We're looking, why do we use metaphors at all? The rabbis are really into metaphors. Why do we use them? Because they help us understand things, right? Examples, their new context. It's a way to communicate. And the rabbis are really focused on people being able to understand, right? And feel like you understand what's happening, right? If you look at the Passover story, it's a full lesson in Jewish education because we're really focused on understanding it, right? And feeling it and connecting. And so maybe this is metaphorical, purely metaphorical, used in a way that gets our attention, right? So that, that speaks to Lewis and says, that's when my dad looked up at me. My dad turned his face up to me, lifted his face up, and there we are. Just the two of us, right?
Yeah, that really says it.
It's a moment. These are moments, and most hopefully beautiful moments. There are sad moments too. It's what life is about.
Yes. I've spoken to this before. I almost never teach with any kind of end goal because I think that that's not the best way to teach a class like this, right? I like us to be all learning together and land wherever we find ourselves. But this is a pretty beautiful place we landed, I think.
Mhm.
I like it. Works for me. And
Me too.
I'm certainly, thank you for everyone for sharing really, really interesting and pretty deep thoughts. And that will definitely stick with me for the rest of the week. It's nice teaching this early in the week. Then I've got all the way till Shabbat to noodle it. So thank you, everybody. We have, I'm Lunch and Learn on Thursday. Rabbi Rines is out today, tomorrow, Thursday. So I'm teaching Lunch and Learn on Thursday and leading the healing service, which will be at 11, Lunch and Learn at 12. And then tomorrow night, we have a women's program for the Immersion Circle, which is a name developed by Moed, the new mikvah happening in Denver. So come to learn more about that project and about the way we look at mikvah and how that can be relevant and meaningful in our world. All women are welcome, so you can invite anyone you'd like. You can register on the website. Free program. And I think that's what I got.
Thank you.
All right,
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you,
Have a
Jody.
Rest of your day.
Bye-bye.
Bye.